Lou Reed didn't just dislike a few bands, he despised them. And he made sure the world knew. But what happens when one of rock's most brutal truth-tellers publicly rips into six of music's biggest names? One feud nearly ended a band's career. Another? It cost him a lifelong friendship. And the final name on this list? Let's just say, Lou Reed took that grudge to the grave. Lou Reed was never one to mince words. He didn't just disagree with the direction of popular music, he waged war against it. And at the top of his hit list, the most beloved band in history, the Beatles. It sounds like career suicide. Who in their right mind would attack the Beatles? They were untouchable, gods in the rock pantheon. But Lou Reed didn't care. If you were fake, pretentious, or commercial, you were fair game. And in Lou's eyes, the Fab Four were all three. In a 1987 interview, Lou Reed casually dropped a bomb. "I never liked the Beatles. I thought they were garbage. Garbage. Not overrated. Not his taste." He called them garbage. And that wasn't just a hot take. It was a worldview. Reed believed rock and roll was born in pain and rebellion. He saw the Beatles as the opposite of that. Cheery, commercial, safe. To him, "I Want to Hold Your Hand" wasn't the sound of a cultural revolution. It was nursery rhyme music with fancy haircuts. But what made this hatred even more dramatic was the timing. Reed was saying this at a point when even the punk and post-punk scenes, groups like The Clash, Susie and the Banshees, even Sonic Youth, had begun citing the Beatles as influence. Lou? He stood alone. Proudly. Stubbornly. He respected rawness. Aggression. Truth. The Beatles were too polished. Too digestible. Lou called them Disney for rock fans. He claimed their music had more in common with jingles than poetry. And he had a point, at least from his perspective. Reed had seen doo-wop on the streets, idolized the raw energy of early rockers like Little Richard, and built his own mythos around pushing boundaries. The Velvet Underground, Reed's legendary band, didn't write love songs. They wrote about heroin, sadomasochism, and existential dread. The Beatles, She Loves You and Yellow Submarine. But the real twist, Lou Reed wasn't just playing a character. His hatred ran deep, and it had consequences. In the early 70s, he was offered a chance to collaborate with George Harrison, who was fascinated by Reed's lyrics. George wanted to merge Lennon's experimental spirit with Reed's street-level storytelling. But Reed flat out declined. He said, "I don't do fairy tales." That rejection didn't just hurt Harrison, it shocked him. George considered Lou Reed one of the most important writers in music. But Lou couldn't get past the association. Anything Beatles adjacent was tainted to him. And when George later told Rolling Stone that Reed had potential if he ever opened up, Lou struck back, calling Harrison's solo work yawn-inducing. The feud stayed cold and bitter. They never spoke again. But perhaps the cruelest part, Lou didn't just hate the Beatles, he blamed them for ruining rock music. He said their influence made the scene soft, that artists stopped speaking truth and started chasing hits. To Reed, rock was supposed to be dangerous. The Beatles, in his mind, made it safe for soccer moms. This wasn't a one-off opinion. Reed repeated this take over decades. In the 90s, while promoting his avant-garde opera-time rocker, he was asked if he was ever moved by Beatles music. He sneered and replied, "No, not once. Not even Rubber Soul, it's cartoon music." That comment drew heat, even from fans who loved Las Provocations. But Reed didn't care. He believed in his truth. To him, music wasn't about being light. It was about being real. And the Beatles? They were just too loved to ever be honest. The irony, of course, is that Lou Reed and John Lennon shared similar roots. New York cool, a hunger to shatter convention, and a hatred for phoniness. But where Lennon evolved toward peace and universal love, Reed dug deeper into alienation and confrontation. Maybe Reed saw in Lennon what could have been, if only he hadn't been trapped in the Beatles machine. Maybe that made the whole thing more bitter. Either way, the divide was set. Lou Reed would never join the cult of Beatles worship, even if it cost him fans, even if it meant isolation. Because to Lou Reed, being hated for the truth was better than being loved for a lie. He once said a certain iconic band was music for narcissists in silk shirts. And when they invited him to open for them on tour, he humiliated them publicly. Next up, the Doors, and the night Lou Reed turned down millions, just to make a point. Jim Morrison once called Lou Reed the most fearless lyricist in America. Lou Reed? He thought Morrison was a fraud. If Lou Reed's hatred for the Beatles was cold and calculated, his disdain for the Doors was emotional, even personal. He saw them not just as posers, but as everything wrong with the drug-fueled rock culture he despised. It all started with a single comment. In 1970, Lou Reed was asked if he thought Morrison was the poet laureate of their generation. He laughed and said, "Morrison writes like a drunk college kid who just discovered Nietzsche." It wasn't a joke. Lou meant it. He thought the Doors were a circus act, loud, indulgent, dripping in faux mysticism. He called their concerts frat house seances. And it wasn't because he didn't believe in performance. Reed respected drama, but only when it was rooted in something real. To him, Morrison was theater, not truth. This disdain wasn't mutual at first. The Doors admired the Velvet Underground. Ray Manzarek once described their debut album as the sound of New York's dark soul. The Doors even requested Lou Reed as an opening act during their 1970 tour. Lou declined, but not quietly. He told their manager, "Tell them I don't open for mimes." Those 5 words made their way back to Morrison. And what began as one-sided dislike became a full-blown feud. But here's where it gets deeper and darker. Reed had personal reasons for despising what the Doors represented. He had battled with addiction for years, had been institutionalized as a teenager, and had seen the real consequences of romanticizing death and drugs. He thought Morrison made heroin look like a philosophy, not a crisis. Reed had no patience for it. He saw young people idolizing the Doors break on through ethos, but dying in real alleyways because of it. To him, the Doors were selling a lie. They weren't rebels. They were selling nihilism in a leather jacket. In a radio interview years later, Reed said, "The Doors made heroin seem like a rite of passage. That's not art. That's irresponsible." And perhaps Reed's harshest blow came not in what he said, but what he refused to say. After Jim Morrison's death in 1971, tributes poured in. Rock stars called him a prophet, a visionary, a lost angel. Lou Reed? He stayed silent. When cornered by a journalist to give a quote, Lou simply replied, "He wanted to die. He got his wish. Let's move on." Brutal, dirty. But it wasn't just cruelty. It was part of Reed's deeper philosophy. Lou believed that rock and roll should challenge people, not seduce them with death myths. He felt the Doors were myth makers, not truth tellers. And the most shocking moment in this Cold War, it came in 1993. That year, the Doors, what remained of them, were planning a tribute show for Morrison's 50th birthday. They invited surviving icons of the era to perform, including Lou Reed. They even offered to let him rewrite one of Morrison's songs for a modern duet. Reed responded with a handwritten letter. 2 sentences. "I wouldn't touch those lyrics with gloves on. Respectfully, Lou." That letter was leaked, and fans were furious. But Reed never apologized. The irony is that both Lou and Morrison were obsessed with pushing limits. But where Morrison swam in symbols and mythology, Lou Reed stayed rooted in street grit. He wanted poetry with dirty hands, not snake dances and desert visions. Their legacies eventually drifted into different corners of music history. Morrison became the patron saint of tortured youth. Reed became the architect of art rock's raw realism. But that hostility never faded. When the Doors were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1993, Reed, already a member by then, was asked to say a few words backstage. He declined. Instead, he walked out, saying, "I've had enough fairy tales for one night." Lou Reed didn't just hate U2's music, he hated their mission. In his eyes, they were the most dangerous kind of band, the ones who pretended to be prophets while cashing giant checks behind the curtain. And what made this feud stand out? It wasn't just personal, it turned legal. It started innocently enough in the early 1990s. U2 was at the height of their fame. Acton Baby had turned them into global icons. Bono was being hailed as a messianic figure, the rock star who could change the world. Humanitarian. Poet. Rebel. Savior. Lou Reed wasn't buying any of it. In fact, when asked what he thought of U2, Lou's reply was one for the ages. "They're like televangelists with guitars." That quote spread fast. But it wasn't just a snide remark. Lou was angry about something deeper. The way U2 used rebellion and poetic suffering as aesthetic tools while living like kings. Lou saw Bono's world tours, the designer sunglasses, the private jets, and it all felt like a betrayal of rock's underground roots. But the real explosion happened in 1997. That year, U2 released the single Last Night on Earth. It included a lyrical phrase nearly identical to a line from Reed's 1972 solo track, "Kill Your Sons." At first, Reed stayed quiet. But when fans and critics started pointing out the similarity, Lou's legal team sent U2's label a formal complaint. He wasn't just accusing them of copying lyrics. He accused them of stealing meaning. The letter read, "It's not just the words, it's the posture, the grief, the pain. You don't get to wear someone else's scars." U2's camp tried to settle the issue quietly. They offered a royalty cut and backstage passes for any upcoming tour dates. Reed refused. He didn't want money. He wanted to make a point. He issued a public statement saying, "You can't buy credibility. You earn it in the gutter, not on a stage with laser lights and tax shelters." That tax shelter remark wasn't random. Reed had recently criticized U2 for moving their publishing to the Netherlands to avoid paying taxes in Ireland, the country they claimed to be helping with activism. Reed called it moral theater with a financial escape clause. The feud ignited the press. Headlines read, "Lou versus Bono, Clash of Titans." At a music industry gala in 1998, the two were accidentally seated at adjacent tables. Witnesses claimed Bono tried to extend a handshake. Lou stared at him and said, "I've seen better actors in off-Broadway death plays." Ouch. Right. But here's the emotional twist. Lou Reed wasn't always this bitter toward U2 too. In the early 80s, he actually admired their raw ambition. He thought Boy in October had some moments of truth. But somewhere along the way, that hunger got replaced with brand. To Lou, U2 stopped making art and started building a religion, one where they were the gods. And that, to Lou Reed, was unforgivable. He believed that true artists broke themselves in public. They exposed ugliness. They didn't airbrush it with social causes or grand speeches. Reed saw pain as sacred. And U2? He thought they turned it into PR war. The fallout of this feud was long-lasting. Reed refused to appear on any compilation projects involving U2. He declined interviews for documentaries that featured them. And when U2 were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2005, Reed skipped the ceremony entirely, despite being invited to present another artist that same night. In 2010, Bono attempted a form of reconciliation. In an op-ed about Reed's contributions to rock, he called Transformer one of the most courageous records ever made. He even said Lou Reed had rewired his soul. Reed's response? Good. Hope he kept the receipt. That quote was printed in Rolling Stone with no follow-up. It was Lau's final word. But under the sarcasm, there was something sad about it. Reed didn't just feel annoyed by Wu, he felt betrayed. He once believed that fame could be a weapon for truth. But in Wu's rise, he saw the dream die. They were the proof that even the boldest rebels could turn into the same machines they once fought. And perhaps that's why this feud cut deeper than all the rest. It wasn't about sound. It was about soul.